All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for making it to our panel on the history of ground control. It's the first time we've ever done something like this, so thank you for joining us in this new experience. Who we've got with us today, we've got Mark Mahoney, who was one of the original employees of ground control. Myself, I'm Mark Santana. I'm the current Office and Promotions Manager at Ground Control, and I've been there for about 7.5 years. Clay Calgill, he's one of the co-owners. Anthony Dandra, he's another of the co-owners. Neil Bradley can't be with us here today. He's got other plans. And Jeffrey McKeechan, another one of the owners, will be joining us any moment now. So he'll rush in and sit down with us. And so basically, ground control's been around for a long time in a few different iterations. Some of you may have been able to visit the original location back on, I think, 12th and Alder. So we're going to start there and just kind of walk through how it's changed over the years and some milestones and some interesting experiences and kind of what we've learned from running an arcade. Anthony, I'm going to start off with you. Can you give us a little bit of background on how ground control started, and we'll ask Mark some questions about his time there too.
All right, we're going to start at the very beginning with these two people. I'm going to try to get this picture up here. This is pretty much where it started. This is Betty and Neil. They were record store clerks at Reverb Records on Hawthorne Avenue, if you remember that place. And while they were working there, they started collecting arcade games and had some arcade games in the record store, and eventually opened their own place on 10th Avenue between Yamhill and Alder. And that was the first ground control. And that's where I started hanging out when I first moved here about 13 years ago. First thing my friend said when I moved into town is that you need to go to ground control. It's like the home that you've been waiting for all your life. So I went there, and it looked kind of like this. Try and get these pictures up quick. As you can see, we've prepared very thoroughly for our presentation.
We're pros at this sort of thing.
Totally pro. So if I open a folder, can I make a slideshow? I guess we'll find out. I'm going to drag this folder to preview and just slideshow it. File, view, slideshow. How nice. What is this? Oh,
that's a little bit later on.
That's a little bit later on.
Yeah, that's Neil's.
I'm just going to play this, and we'll see where we get. But the first ground control was across the street from the Presbyterian Church on 10th Avenue. There used to be a renovated hotel over there for recovering addicts. Not the greatest neighborhood. It was pretty hidden away. You kind of had to know about ground control ahead of time to go there and find it. They didn't do a whole lot of advertising. It was just Betty and Neil running it with one or two employees maybe. They had the enthusiasm for it, certainly, but not necessarily the resources. They, when I started hanging out, they pretty much immediately asked me to help them keep some games running. And I just started spending more and more time hanging out. I would come in and fix games as needed, and eventually I had some of my own games there. And as time went on, they asked me if I knew anyone who would like to take it over, because they were both wanting to move on to other things. And I certainly wanted to, but I knew I didn't have the resources either. So got online and looked around for local resources, and as luck would have it, the Pacific Northwest is home to a lot of creative and talented people who are interested in arcade culture and arcade history, including these folks here. And I found Clay, and I found Neil Bradley, and they brought in their business partners, and we all got together, and I introduced the idea of ground control to them, and they saw a lot of potential, and so we formed a partnership and went for it.
And so, before we get too deeper into you guys Oh, here's Jeffrey. Before we get too much deeper into that, let's get into Mark a little bit with how he got into ground control and his experience working there before you guys entered the picture. So, Mark, how did you end up working at ground control?
Well, I've been working a series of terrible jobs since moving to Oregon in 2000, I guess, and had decided finally I was just going to go back to college, but needed a part-time job. And I used to hang out, kind of started around the same time Anthony was going in there, but I never ran into him. Just hung out there a lot, played a lot of games. Brought up that I needed a job to Neil, the original owner, and he hired me on part-time under the table. I wound up being the last employee he had there before he sold the company. And it's funny looking at these photos because it's hard to, or it's easy to forget that ground control really was a place in search of an identity back then.
Right.
I don't know if you guys saw, but there was a shot of used VHS cassettes. That used to actually be a big part of our business, along with bootleg CDs.
Where's that counter picture? I got the picture of the counter.
Yeah, the counter picture's pretty telling.
Yeah, just jam-packed with
Yeah,
stuff.
it's like IKEA shelving and Christmas
Yeah.
lights and yeah, like literally anything Neil could find to sell.
That was my old neighbor's couch we hauled in.
Oh yeah, that's right, that couch. And so as a result, it was like a really interesting mixed clientele as well, not just because of the neighborhood, which very much contributed to that, but just yeah, there were like VHS customers, people who only came in to buy and sell used VHS. We were kind of a rental store.
Because you would buy things back and then they would pick new things.
Yeah, and there was like one guy who used to come in. It was like we were actually his rental store. And I remember the day I told him we weren't going to do videos anymore. The last thing I ever heard from him was some sort of very sweary gypsy curse type thing. It was just like, yeah, it was a part of the business I was happy to see go.
There was a surprising amount of open hostility when we actually got rid of some of the VHS.
Yeah, people got real mad. And actually, like, I mean, at first, when I first started, this was kind of cool, only because it was so slow some nights that I would just watch movies. And I remember actually trying to watch Godzilla, the 2000 edition, and I fell asleep at the counter for like an hour, and no one noticed. So that was a weird time. But yeah, so I worked there under the table for Neil. I was like the last employee he had. Everyone else had kind of gone. Unfortunately, like these guys kept me on when they decided to buy the place, and that's when it really started finding, I think, its current identity, at least the long road towards that.
What was your day-to-day like there, though, under the original owners? Like, what was it like working there?
It was usually pretty quiet. I did a lot of homework. There was, Anthony alluded to the fact that there was like a methadone clinic across the street, which was kind of good and bad. Some of our best customers were people who were, dealing with a very difficult time in their lives and just needed to focus on something else. And they played a lot of Miss Pac-Man, a lot of Burger Time. And so it was kind of cool in that way. But then another part of the customer base that came through the door every day was like just people with screwdrivers looking to get into games. And like, it was just weird. It was like you kind of had to police it a lot. We stopped letting people use the restroom. I mean, it was like a strange mix of things. I mean, and then there was just people who came in to play games a lot, and there's the VHS customers, and there's people buying used Ataris, and so it was kind of a weird mix of things. Pricing things, buying things off people. There's like a real flea market aspect to it in a way.
Right.
So yeah, it was a very, every day was real different back then.
And just because I'm not exactly sure where this lands on the timeline, the Hawthorne location opened up under Neil and Betty, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So real briefly, there was actually a second location of ground control on Hawthorne at about 34th, I think. Very small location. Did you guys have any experience with that?
I went there as a customer, but I never actually, that had closed, and Neil was actually really bitter about that location. That had actually closed right before I started there and wound up costing them a ton of money.
I spent a little time over there too. It was in the neighborhood where I first moved to Portland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they just had one or two employees at the time that would fill in. And I would see them over there. In fact, there are no photos of the Hawthorne location that I can find anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever heard of the Human Clock Project, where everybody holds up an hour and minute sign, One of those pictures is of the Hawthorne location of Ground Control. I've been trying to find it ever since.
That's the website where you load up the website.
Yeah, and
Each-
pictures
yeah.
go by, people holding up at a time, yeah. But one of those, that's all that's known of the Hawthorne
It's a
location.
really weird thing.
Except-
I remember they had a bunch of older games, and I think, was it Neil who broke down what they would have had to earn per square foot in there? And the games that they had in there were clearly like never going to make that much money.
Yes, Neil and I went by there one time, and we looked around, went, how on earth are they going to make enough money to keep this place open? And they didn't. It was just, the numbers just, it was crazy.
Yeah, rent over there is ridiculously high. I mean, they did get a lot of exposure from it. I mean, it's the most expensive billboard you can imagine. And we heard about the Hawthorne location for years afterwards, after it closed. So, did you guys used to be on Hawthorne? Did you move here? Like, no, this is the first one. It's always been here. But nobody knew about it.
And Neil, Neil
I've
used to
heard
get-
about the Hawthorne location as recently as like a year ago. So people still remember it.
The original Neil used to get real bad when people would like suggest he should open an arcade up in that area because he
Right.
tried and like no one went
Yeah.
and like it tossed him a ton of money and people come like, oh man, you should open another location. Yeah, he used to get real mad. He got mad at a lot of people though.
Right, and may as well speak to that a little bit as part of the transition between his ownership and the new ownership.
Yeah, I mean, he was a really interesting dude. He really took me under his wing and helped me out. We were really good friends. There were a lot of people who seemed fairly relieved when he sold the place. There's a lot of customers who kind of had stopped coming. He could be abrasive. Towards the end, it was very difficult. He was like Anthony said, I think he was buried in kind of in a sense, technical debt, and then in a sense, real debt. And it just became a difficult business for him to run. It's hard, you know. It's like these things make quarters, and they don't really like. Running an arcade on its own merits, just as an arcade, is not really a feasible business model. And he made it work for a long time, and I think, really hit on an idea that no one else had thought of, like these vintage games. So he deserves a lot of credit, but yeah, he was not the best person to put behind the counter. Just a really, interesting dude.
Yeah.
Another interesting story about him real quick. A pigeon with a broken wing once walked into the original Ground Control location and hid under the Willamette Week newspaper rack. And he actually took that pigeon home, nursed it back to health, and released it at Laurelhurst. Very compassionate person in some sense.
It's like a Portlandia sketch before its time.
Yeah. Let's see here.
I think I just wanted to add real quick that the feeling, you were talking about the sort of random catch-all feeling of the first Ground Control before we got involved. It felt like a pet project, like a hobby almost, you know? And it was like whatever he felt like having behind the counter, like he was into Atari computers and stuff like that, so that was up on the shelf, Christmas lights on it.
The other thing I should mention too, Neil, original owner, Neil, had a pretty strict, nothing newer than 1982-ish, what was the list. So I mean, a lot of what we ended up putting into Ground Control and contributing a lot to the popularity were machines that came after that. So if you're restricting arcade games to kind of Asteroids era or earlier, it's a pretty short list. I mean, you pick up a lot of good stuff from the early 80s, but anybody that's under our age, mid 40s, later 40s, not into those, so it was the 90s and JAMA games and Konami stuff and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and all that was a big part of the change that we introduced right off the bat, was sort of allowing all classics and not just early 80s stuff.
Not just super retro. So Anthony had started talking a bit about how these guys got together to purchase Ground Control. And before we get into the transition and the changes you guys made and kind of the challenges you faced from day one, can each of you just give me like a brief history, like why would you get into an arcade? Like what was your experience? What drove you to want to do this? Go ahead and start, Anthony.
Okay. I'm a huge nerd. I was obsessed with arcade games and computer games and video games ever since I was 12. I think I imprinted on them, like ducklings do. I saw an Atari and I was like, "Are you my mommy?" I'm home. This is great. So yeah, I lived in arcades when I was a teenager, started writing computer games. Got some published even, back in the heyday of home computers, before this early PC days. People were still using Atari and Commodore and Apple home computers. Went to college for computer science, got a software degree. Worked in the multimedia industry for a while and designed pretty big name design firms. So I was lucky to kind of fall into good jobs there. Working on CD-ROMs, making things in Director and things like that. And then moved out here. And along the way, while I was in college, I started collecting arcade games. I think everyone here has had experience with that at this table. I live near the Ohio State Fairgrounds, and the Midwest is really a hotbed of amusement device business. You know, Chicago's out there with pinball and Williams and everything. So there was just tons of arcade games out there for relatively cheap, and they were auctioning them off once or twice a month in a massive warehouse on the fairgrounds. And I lived 2 blocks away. So it was like catnip. And so I moved out here with arcade games, and that's when my friends sent me to the first Ground Control, and then the rest was history. Why don't you go next?
I fell in love with pinball in 1972 when I was 9, and later that year, my best friend got a Magnavox Odyssey 1, which is the first home video game. It was so old that it came with color overlays that were printed on plastic that you would stick to the screen of your black and white TV to generate the background for the very primitive graphics. It was so primitive it didn't even have a CPU in it. But that started me into video games, and throughout the 70s, played them whenever I could find them, which up until I think our mall got a arcade when I was about 15. This is about 1978. So me and my little brother started going to the arcade a lot. And then when I was in college, the movie Tron came out. And there was nothing I wanted to do more than be like Kevin Flynn. I thought, gee, what more could you want than to have a software business and an arcade? So that's how my life turned out.
All right, so like most of these guys grew up in the 80s and was a big computer nerd, for lack of a better word. So I ran the Atari users group down in Roseburg, Oregon. I think there was 7 of us or something like that. And like Jeffrey, spent way too many hours a week trying to program light cycle games in BASIC on an Atari 800. So I went to school at Oregon State, studied computer science, and right about then, sort of late 80s, a lot of the early 80s and older arcade games were basically seen as worthless. Newer machines had come out and people just wouldn't play the old, Tempest or Asteroids or any of that stuff. So like Anthony had mentioned, they were for sale dirt cheap. And as it turned out, local to the Corvallis kind of college area, there was a couple of route operators that had tons of games. And as far as they were concerned, it was costing them money taking up storage space. So I got into the habit of checking the nickel ad kind of things and looking for arcade games and basically buying them and stashing them at friends' houses and out on patios at rental houses and everything else. So that was back in the days of $75 Tempest machines, and maybe you spend $100 for a good Star Wars. That was kind of the way things used to be. Tack on a zero to those now. After college, I worked in the computer industry. Company called Supra Corporation. We made CPU accelerators and hard drives and modems for Amigas and Atari STs and whatnot. And later on went on to do stuff in MP3 players and sort of later tech. But in college, kind of back pre-internet days, so to speak, the news groups were kind of how you connected to people. And there were the old rec games video and rec games video arcade collecting and stuff where, you know, it was kind of a small group at the time, but if you had enough small groups at enough colleges, you actually kind of form these networks. And like Anthony said, you know, different parts of the country would have access to different things, you know, so it'd be the guys in Chicago around Chicago Gaming Company and Williams and Stern. There's tons of pinball stuff there. Down in the Bay Area, you'd get an awful lot of surplus gaming stuff coming out of Atari Games and Key Games and some of those places down there. So again, it was people putting stuff up, and it would be, this was back before the internet was commercial, so you weren't allowed to have a commercial for sale post except for one news group on the internet. So you kind of develop these little groups of friends, and you trade parts and buy and sell stuff cheap. Down in Eugene, there was a company called Great Western Trading Company, and they were sort of, you know, where games went to die. They'd sell off the parts, and it was pretty much by the pound. So literally, when I was working at Diamond Multimedia, I'd have these boxes delivered. You know, it'd be a good size, you know, large microwave-sized boxes that were just packed with boards. And I think they were like $5 a pound. And it was sort of, you take what you got, just load up on them. And I sort of developed a relationship with Tim, the guy that owned that place. And we sort of had this running joke where I was annoyed by new games. I didn't like JAMA games and new stuff that had come out because I wanted all the, you know, the 80s classic stuff. So as a sort of running joke, he would throw in new arcade game boards whenever I'd order old stuff. So I would, you know, I'd get my one Asteroids board, and there'd be like 9 Street Fighter boards packed in there. And he would, instead of packing material, he would use Nintendo PlayChoice 10 boards, which were the 10-game arcade thing, and just stuck them in every little nook and cranny, so I'd be unloading things and finding them. So as luck would have it, I was sort of the arcade game hoarder, and at a certain point you need to be, I got to do something with this stuff, and Anthony comes up with, hey, let's have an arcade. So that was instant use of all of the crap that I've accumulated. So to this day, we still go through parts from those, you know, decades back.
Yeah, we definitely still benefit from Clay's massive collection. It's crazy. You guys decided to partner up, form Time Warp Incorporated, and purchase Ground Control. What was that first day like? I know we've got an email from Neil, Anthony, if you want to try and dig that up. But what was it like taking things over, getting the keys?
I just want to mention one thing about Neil. Neil isn't here. This
is our partner, Neil.
Yes, I've known Neil for about 20 years. We met on the internet. He was one of the first people I met. We got into an argument about some old Japanese synthesizer, and we wound up getting together and forming a company and rewriting the firmware for that synthesizer. And so we had a business prior to Time Warp, and Neil has worked at Intel for a long time, ever since I've known him and before. And today he's out at Portland International Raceway, turning right. That's what he loves to do, and today's the last track day of the year, so that's why he's not here.
I should jump in for 1 second too, just mention, for the sake of completeness, one of my business partners, a guy named Matt Schneider, was actually a 5th owner early on at Ground Control. We had worked together for a number of years at Diamond Multimedia doing firmware stuff and MP3 players, like I mentioned. So he actually came on with me, Jeffrey and Neil were sort of paired up, and Anthony brought everybody together, so that's how it came to be. And then a few years later, we ended up buying Matt out of the business, so it's just 4 of us owners.
Just to give a little background for Neil Bradley, who's not here today. I found him online through the message boards that Clay described. He's an avid pinball player and collector, but at the time he had been developing one of the early arcade emulators with an acquaintance of his called it was called Retrocade, and he was already emulating 80s arcade games at high speed. He's quite a skilled programmer. At the time that I found him, and something that he brings to the partnership is a lot of extensive arcade pinball experience. What else should I add about that? Well, I just wanted to make sure, give you a little bit of his background since he couldn't be here. And what's on the screen now is his email writing back to the team about how things were going on our very first day. Let's see where we're at here.
That was a lot less swearing than most emails during that time.
Yeah, I have to say
Was not edited at all.
Yeah, there was a lot to renovate when we first got in there. Let's see what we got here. There was a stage because Keneal. Let's make this simple. The first Neil, we called him Keneal because he spelled it Kneel, and he was kind of gothy industrial dressing kind of guy, and he had a band, and he would invite his industrial band friends to play on stage in his place. So let's see what we did. We removed most of the stage. Neil likes to work on stereo equipment, or basically designs the speakers and amplifiers. We put in a new stereo system. Oh yes, the front door didn't have a closer. It would just swing in the breeze.
The outside lights were not working, so we replaced those.
Neil and I fixed some games, vacuumed the carpet. The place was lit with black light tubes. So it was like the, cosmic bowling look at night, basically.
Actually, Keneal put in the black light tubes early, but then he had so many problems with vandalism that he started turning on the really bright 8-foot fluorescence overheads instead of the black lights. So Neil and I were both regulars at Ground Control, and we hated those overhead lights. So we vowed the very first thing we were going to do was get rid of those overhead lights and bring back the black lights, no matter what it took.
Yeah, it was definitely much better at night once we had that. Oh, we had a disco ball.
Yes.
We cleaned the disco ball for the first time, probably for the first time since it was installed before we got in.
It was hard to reach. It was hard to reach. What do you want?
Yeah.
So let's leave this up here for a second. We can let people kind of pour over it while we get into some more kind of first year stuff now, because there was there's still a lot to go through, and there's
That's
a lot
true.
that happened
We don't have a lot of time.
that first year. So I know you guys had a very interesting first year. What were some of the bigger things that happened, both good and bad? I know there was some kind of break-in that happened pretty early on.
Well, let me just set the stage. When we first took over, I volunteered to manage everything because I didn't know any better. And I was down there with these guys online checking in on how things are going, and I'm desperately trying to do everything with no money and just 1 or 2 employees, and not really. I was basically being paid in ownership, so I wasn't making a lot of money either. But we more or less, kept it going on a shoestring. Some things that happened. Let's see. Well, first, not even 2 months into it, I got a police call. I got a call from Neil Bradley at 3 in the morning that the doors had been broken in. Got a police call. So I rode my bike over there because they didn't have a car. I was doing everything by bike then, and somebody had kicked the doors in and ripped the change machine off the post and pulled it away. Little did they know it had $75 in it.
Yeah, I was going to say that they probably couldn't even get it open anyway, so there's probably a change machine at the bottom of the Willamette right now with $80 in quarters.
Yeah, pretty much. And as Mark was mentioning, the original owner's clientele was still wandering in, I have a lot of pictures of the first Ground Control empty because there weren't any customers.
Why don't you, do you want to have some of those 1.0 pictures?
Yeah, we'll get this.
Sliding
Let's
through
get this
while we
slideshow going again.
continue.
Early on, it was definitely a good place to get homework done while you were being paid.
Yeah,
Everything was done by hand. I mean, we had a little plastic Casio cash register with 9 categories,
You know what I mean? Money, it's easy to put it in the plastic cash register. We need to emphasize the fact that this was, shoestring budget. Anthony was working basically for free. Mark was our only paid person.
Yeah.
And, I don't ever remember us really losing much per month ever, but it never made any. I mean, let me just go off on this sign. This thing is still like the first picture you see on Google Images. If you type in ground control, drives me out of my mind. I don't know how it got on there, but it persists to this day. But that was the A-board sign we had on the
We still have that somewhere.
Yeah.
We don't throw away anything.
Well, actually, you guys did throw it away on my porch after I promised to replace it for like a year. I'll volunteer that. I mean, I was like promising to do all kinds of things that didn't get done, and finally that A-board, I mean, it was starting to like rot. And one morning I walked out my door to go to ground control, and there's the A-board in a splintered pile on my front step.
Do you guys still have the vinyl sign that used to be the ground control sign somewhere?
yeah.
It was basically this, but
Somewhere.
like a big vinyl sign. I mean, that was the only signage we had for years.
But I mean, this sign was handmade. Like Keneal made it with the spray can and some homemade stencils. That's how he was doing things, and that's how we kind of did too at the start.
Yeah, call it one of those pictures, and then we'll talk about.
Back there, quick. That's Seth. That's 8-Bit Weapon, who has been playing here all weekend, doing the first Micropalooza event back in 03. Yeah.
Yeah, that was our first year. I had an interest in doing shows too. I actually came from sort of putting on rave events back in the Midwest in the early 90s. And actually, I know Chuck Van Pelt from that scene. And he and I were ravers in the early 90s, and he came to our shows back there. And so when he walked into ground control, we like kind of reunited, and now we're involved in this crazy show.
Yeah, and I guess not to jump around real quick, but that was how I met Chuck too. Is he would come in with truckloads of NES and SNES equipment and sell it all to us. And at first we didn't know where this guy was getting this stuff. We were kind of dubious, but then we realized no, he was going to every single Goodwill, every garage sale, collecting this stuff and bringing it to us.
And just to make sure we embarrass everyone here at the table and involved in this place, his DJ name back then was DJ Easy Cheese. Anyway, first year ground control stuff. Yeah, these are pictures from the first.
That was big.
The first micro music show.
If you skip forward a couple, see if you can find one of the Commodore users group, Robert Bernard.
Oh, that's at the beginning. Those guys were at the Micropalooza show.
Oh,
yeah.
back there you go.
Yeah, this is at Micropalooza. It was a micro music concert and computer club meeting.
So now you can see in the back row there, that is Jerry Ellsworth, who is doing some pretty cool augmented reality stuff now. Castar, they're going to be kickstarting here pretty quick. Jerry's been around for a long time. She did the Commodore 64 joystick and a bunch of other stuff. We worked together actually on some arcade game stuff, so that's how she's tied in with that whole thing too.
In the first year, we were kind of trying to rapidly upgrade things that we saw, phase out things that didn't really fit what we had in mind and upgrade things that seemed to have potential. I'll confess at the very beginning, I treated it like a personal hobby, probably the same way Keneal did, and these guys were like, no, you need to get rid of the records. You need to get rid of the cassettes, and we're going to simplify and focus on what really matters. And the first thing we did, we started bringing in newer consoles, because that was still a big presence at ground control. So we started phasing in NES, Super NES. Had someone come in named her name is Virginia Johnson. I'm going to do a profile on her on our history feed soon. She had been working computers for almost 30 years and brought in 2 carloads of amazing console stuff that really kickstarted the Nintendo stuff for us. I'm going to try to bring up a picture for you guys to drool over. Anybody else want to talk about the first year while I find this?
One of the first things I learned was that even though the arcade could be completely empty with just one customer, if I wanted to work on a particular game, that is where the customer would camp out, and they would have the game of their lives. They could play for 20, 30 minutes while I waited for them to finish. And that rule still holds true today. When the techs want to work on a game, that's where people camp out. It's uncanny.
Every single pinball table they ever had to open up, the 2 next to it became the highest earning machines in the place every time. for years.
So yeah, real quick, we can talk about this really cool find that Virginia brought in.
Yeah, so in the carload of vintage console stuff, Atari computers and everything, I mean, she had preserved everything she had collected games for about 30 years and kept them in her barn. She lived on a farm. And, in the box of all complete boxed NES games is Dragon Warriors 1 through 4, all complete with the maps, everything in there. And she basically single-handedly started our Super NES console line with all of her stuff. In fact, this collection, a woman came in and bought these 4 games specifically as a gift for her husband, as a group. So.
I think that was our highest earning day ever up to that point.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the arcade just didn't make very much money. We were just trying to, make the place break even any way we could. There was no alcohol service. We closed. What were the hours then? It was like we closed at 10 usually, and then
It was pretty arbitrary.
Yeah.
When we were done for the day.
It was usually dead after 8 p.m., except on Friday and Saturday nights, we'd still have people at midnight, but then we'd close around midnight.
So so part of the reason you guys decided to move was to try and boost the business and look forward to expanding opportunities and things like that. So in 2004, you guys found a new location and decided to move. What was that like, moving the arcade in one day to the new location?
Well, I should go into why we decided to move.
Yeah.
We felt like we were on the back end of downtown, and there wasn't a lot of traffic there, and there wasn't much going on. So there were exciting things happening in Old Town. Compound and Backspace seemed like compatible businesses, so we scouted around for locations, and we found our current location, which used to be Cisco and Pancho's Mexican restaurant. And oh boy, it had an adobe chimney that for some reason Anthony and Matt thought it was really cool and that we should keep that chimney.
P.S. That place closed because someone was murdered there.
Matt's not here to defend himself, so we'll put on Matt.
Yeah.
I found this place on my bike, by the way. I mean, to scout locations, I rode around downtown on a bicycle. And this was actually the last place that I found. And I said, what do you guys think of this place? And he said, I called it the Star Wars Cantina. And that's what it ended up being.
Showed them some of the interior pictures. It was a mess. And when we looked at it, we were like, my God, how are we going to make an arcade out of this? So anyway, we worked out a lease with the landlord and started coming up with plans for where we were going to put games and what we were going to do there. And conveniently, the location had a bar, and we had already been thinking about starting to serve alcohol because, well, one night I was sitting at Ground Control 1.0 talking to Mark, and I said, gee, we're really empty right now, and people are leaving, and it's about the time the bars are starting to fill up right now. Maybe if we had alcohol, we could keep people here playing games. So that started us down the road to getting an alcohol license, and good thing we did, because when we moved over to the new location, people forgot about us. For some reason, our old customers couldn't find us. They didn't know how to use Google. So things were pretty dead there for the first few months at the new location. We were losing money. Actually, for the first time, we were starting to lose money.
Yeah, the rent was higher. We didn't have the alcohol service yet. We were basically had our old business model in a new location with higher rent and fewer customers, and because things were getting a little dire, so we had to make a big change, and that was it.
So, yeah, so you, Jeffrey, got into why you guys decided to start serving beer, which I believe was in 2005. You finally were able to serve your first beer. If you want to pull up our shot of that particular milestone. Yeah, there's in preparing for this, we found that we have way too much stuff to get into, so we're trying to condense it into something that is easy to digest. So there's the first beer at GK being served. One of those guys, the guy.
It's Andrea,
Stroke-
actually,
stroke-
on the left.
Yeah, Andrea it was her 21st birthday. Yeah, she was the first one to get a beer, right?
Yeah.
And then just as a real quick aside, the guy next to her, his name is Myron. He was our technician for a while, and now he's out like sailing ships or doing something. I don't know. People come and go. So.
Oh yeah, show that. That's
Oh right.
yes. There were Mexican scenes sandblasted into glass over the bar.
Did you see that shot of the bathroom? You could pull up the Spanish tile bathroom real quick too.
We used to joke that we had the ugliest bathrooms in Portland.
So, beer service kicked off, and Mark spent a lot of time behind the bar, bartending. It was all bottles and cans. Yeah, clap your hands. Did that seem to help right away? Was that a pretty much an immediate success, or was it still?
It took time.
Yeah.
It really took a while to find our audience. And one of the things we did to do that was we started to have a lot of shows.
Mm-hmm.
We moved our stage over from the old location, and we put in a little bit better sound system, and somehow we managed to cram sometimes like 3 bands onto that tiny little stage.
Yep.
The Micropalooza shows continued too after a couple year hiatus. We brought mini bosses in to play a second time at the new location. And we had a stage basically, as you walk into the current location, if you look to the right, the entire right front corner of the room was a stage, about 25 foot on the long side.
If you could, just show of hands quick, how many people have been to ground control at its current location? Vast majority. Okay, thank you. Cool.
How many of you went to the original location? Thank you.
So, so live music actually was an interesting experiment. There were good nights, there were bad nights. We had a lot of metal shows and punk rock shows, and stuff was kind of all over the place. But that was a really good way to draw new people down and show them this place that they hadn't heard of, or maybe they'd heard about and hadn't had a chance to check it out. And that's actually when I got in there, I spent a lot of time booking shows, which like one of our flyers from old shows.
Yeah, these are various flyers from different shows we've had over the years.
And so we do have to kind of accelerate closer to present time here.
Yes.
So 2008, GK finally paid it. Yeah, that was true. We had to apologize up front for our bathroom at a certain point. So 2008, GK finally paid off its initial loans to get started.
We did not make any money for the first 5 years. It took us 5 years to pay back our initial investment.
Yeah, that's a pretty gnarly flyer. I'm not sure if we should show that. It was a big part of our history, and I don't mean to skip over it so quickly, but there was a lot. There was a lot to get into there.
So one of the big things that happened was the Save the Arcades 2 contest, which pitted us against an arcade in Florida and one in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And basically Stride Gum wanted us to drive traffic to their website to play this Robotron knockoff called Cowbots. And so we did everything we could to get people to play Cowbots, including having an all-night Cowbots tournament where we were literally open all night.
24 hours.
Playing
Yeah.
Cowbots.
Yeah, yeah. I think we kind of blew them away with how dedicated we were to winning this contest and how loyal our fan base was. So, did anyone out there? Were you around for the Cowbots thing? Did you play the game? Thank you so much.
Thank you very
it worked.
much.
It worked. Yeah, it was amazing. The response was amazing, and everyone was really dedicated to making this happen because we knew this was a significant chance to actually kickstart a proper remodel.
Yeah. Just something about these flyers as they go by. In the early years, I was mentioning how we did everything ourselves. We basically played amateur graphic designers too. We made our own. Basically, if you wanted to do a show, you booked it, you made the posters, you went around town and put them up, and just did all the promotion yourself. So a lot of these posters are like made by people at this table.
And the guy pictured here was our main music booker, Anthony Lusk.
So, yeah, we were lucky enough after a few months of being in this competition to win the competition, and that kind of prompted the owners to realize that doing a big overhaul and remodel was actually feasible, possible. Before it was just overwhelmingly expensive. So that $25,000 went into the bucket to turn GK into what we call GK 3.0.
Lasted about 12 seconds after.
Yeah, the bathroom alone costs a lot more than that. And part of the process was we had to completely shut down the location at 5th and Cooch, move everything across the street. We were lucky enough to have a couple of empty spaces in the building across the street that belonged to our landlord. We moved the entire arcade over, again in a day or so, to a temporary location and just kind of set up shop for a few months.
But the space that we were supposed to move into wasn't ready because the
There was like an art event.
there was a construction problem getting it ready. So we moved into a second temporary space for 11 days. So we moved the arcade twice in less than 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's the
Yes,
first temporary
this is the first
location.
warp zone that we moved to.
Yeah, we were there for.
Luckily, the second warp zone was in the same building, so it was pretty easy to move there.
I still
But,
can't believe you guys moved that entire bar.
Yeah,
That
we
is
moved the
crazy.
bar. Yeah, you guys took the bar out from original GK and wheeled it down the street.
Like
Because
literally
we
put
needed
the
a
whole
bar.
thing on casters. Like it was.
There's a picture on the website if you want to look it up.
Yeah, we were crazy enough to, I don't know, I just thought, well, we can do this thing. So we moved the entire arcade twice in less than 2 weeks. And the reason why is, we could have closed down for 2 months and it wouldn't have hurt the owners very much, but basically the employees would have been out of work and I didn't want to see them suffer, have a hard time paying rent. So I thought we got to keep this thing going. And our loyal customers too would have been missing their ground control fix, so we did it.
Just real quick, the pictures I wanted to show is it's kind of a continuation of the do-it-yourself way of doing things that we had from the beginning. At first, it was because we had no choice, but as it turns out, as we've been able to bring more people on, it's freed up these guys to do more creative and expert level projects, and a lot of it you'll see on display at the new current ground control. These pictures show if you've been there, you've seen the pendant lights that hang over the main room and fiber optic lighting and so on. That's really all up to Clay. Clay basically designed them and engineered them himself, and here's some pictures of behind the scenes.
So actually, hey Jake, how much time do we realistically have? I want to try and do a few questions.
We have 10 minutes.
The next one starts, so basically you have
3
3 minutes.
minutes? Okay. Is there anything else we feel like we have to cover? I would like to try and take a couple questions, just so it's not all us talking. Okay. All right. We can do a couple quick questions if anyone has anything about GK. You first, sir.
Hi, is this a retro thing, like as far as, the future of ground control? Where are we that window's closed, where do you think ground control will be?
You know, I kind of feel like it's still going to persist and still have a loyal fan base. I'm not trying to say that we're entirely outside of like the wave of popularity, but it has kind of existed since before that was so like prominent, and it's inspired a lot of similar businesses around the country. So I think we're lucky enough that we've had time to build up a really strong following. So I don't think it's going to be a shock to our system if it's not popular to open these types of businesses, you know, and for everyone to give it a shot. I think we're going to just keep going and just keep preserving this as long as we can, as long as it's sustainable.
And a lot of those other barcades out there have told us that we were their inspiration. Everyone from Zanzibar in Louisville, Kentucky, to Dorky's up in Tacoma.
So I think we should probably do one more question. That way we can, 2 more questions, all right. So you next?
What's next? What's the next goal or hurdle?
Oh, well, we were planning to expand into the space behind us, and we spent a lot of money, and we had a plan that the city said was workable, and then a month later they said, well, we changed our minds. We need you to pay us $25,000 to completely research this, and that made it unfeasible. So that was like 3 months of work on my part trying to make that happen, and we're trying to figure out what we want to do now.
Go ahead. Like day-to-day obstacle? You can kind of take your pick. There's a lot of challenges. I think, well, I just mean like running a business period, running a bar, running an arcade. They're all unique challenges. I think game maintenance is far and ahead, far and away, like that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that as that, you know, you can kind of copy what's going on at ground control, but if it wasn't for the sort of the expert experience of the guys that I was lucky enough to find to form a team, I mean, they're basically keeping things going with their expertise and the resources they have.
I mean, I think on the arcade game side, video games, our attrition rate, we probably lose 1 or 2 a day. And we're at the point now where we have basically 2 full-time tech people just to keep stuff kind of afloat. And then us owner types, you know, like I said, we've got kind of deep pool of parts and experience fixing the harder problems. So, you know, tech guys keep things beat down, and then once it gets to a point where something's broken beyond normal repair, then it comes off the line and we take time and fix it. But if you had to pay out of pocket to do that from the get-go, and especially things like you can't even find CRT monitors new now, you know, it's LCDs or not. So there's a lot of buying everything you can get your hands on just to make sure that you have those second and third spares down the road, just keep stuff running.
So I think that'll do it for our time. I just want to say, obviously, thanks to the owners that made it down here today to participate in this. It was a lot of fun. Thanks to Mark for coming back out of retirement to talk about this stuff. He's moved way ahead. And thanks to every single one of you for being here, for also supporting Ground Control. If you get to go to Ground Control as a customer, we love you. We really hope we're doing it right by you, and we're going to keep it going as long as we can. Thank you.
I'm just amazed that anyone would want to listen to us talk about the old days of ground control.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Just for a bonus, here's Art dressed as Cubert.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, everyone.